I was carrying the tea tray when I heard her voice, Fiona's voice, coming through the crack in the study door. It was a whisper, sharp and thin like a needle. "It's just endless," she said. "The bills, the debt. If we could just sell this house, we could finally breathe." The tray in my hands, the one my late husband, Robert, had bought me in London, began to tremble. The fine china cups, painted with tiny blue forget-me-nots, rattled against their saucers. A tiny earthquake in my hands. I stopped in the hallway, my feet frozen to the floorboards Robert and I had laid ourselves 40 years ago. My entire body went cold, a sudden, shocking chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. There was a pause, a heavy, weighted silence. I held my breath, praying that my son, my Thomas, would say something, anything, that he would defend me, defend the sanctity of this home, of my life. And then he spoke. "Don't say that, Fee." But there was no anger in his voice, no shock, no defense, just a deep, profound weariness, the sound of a man who had already surrendered. It was the tired sigh of agreement, thinly veiled by the performance of familial duty. He wasn't telling her she was wrong. He was telling her not to say the quiet part out loud. "But it's true," she pushed, her whisper growing harder, more insistent. "It would be so much simpler for everyone if, well, you know, 2 words. And in them, I heard my own obituary being written. They weren't just talking about a house. They weren't just talking about money. They were talking about my life as an inconvenience, an obstacle between them and their comfort, the final clause in a contract that was taking too long to execute. Something inside of me, something warm and soft that had lived for 72 years, simply went quiet and still. The mother I had been for 45 years would have turned around. She would have fled back to the kitchen, pretending she hadn't heard, and the poison would have festered inside her. But that mother died in the hallway, right there on the floorboards Robert had laid. The woman who was left was someone else, someone colder, someone who needed to know. I needed to see their faces as they discussed my demise. I needed to know if this was a fleeting, ugly thought, or if it was the soil in which they now lived. My hands stopped trembling. I took a deep, silent breath, composing my face into a mask of benign pleasantry. I had to go in there. I had to look them in the eye. I had to gather all the evidence before I pronounced my sentence. I walked the final few steps down the hall. This time, the floorboards didn't feel like home. They felt like a stage. I pushed the study door open gently, a grandmotherly smile fixed on my lips. "I thought you might like some tea," I said, my voice even. It didn't even tremble. I was surprised by its steadiness. They both looked up, their faces a mixture of impatience and mild surprise, the illusion of a family meeting. Thomas waved a hand dismissively, his eyes already flicking back to the laptop screen in front of him. "Not right now, Mom. We're in the middle of something important." Important. More important than the woman who gave you life. Fiona didn't even look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the wall behind me, on the tall grandfather clock that had belonged to Robert's father. I watched her eyes. She wasn't seeing a family heirloom. She was appraising it. I could see the dollar signs clicking behind her pupils. She was mentally cataloging every item in the house, adding it all up. My life was just the largest number in her calculation. "All right then," I said, forcing my smile to remain. "Just let me know." I stepped further into the room, moving towards the small side table to place the tray down. It was a deliberate move, a calculated step that would take me past Thomas's chair. My eyes flickered to his laptop screen. It was just for a second. but a second was all I needed. He had a browser window open. The tab read, Online Property Valuation. Get your free estimate now. Below it, in large, friendly letters, was the address of my home, our home, and a number, a very large number, with lots of zeros. The ice in my veins solidified. It wasn't just a thought. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a plan. They were researching. They were preparing, waiting. The warmth from the teapot I was still holding seeped through the silver, but I couldn't feel it. Thomas, dear, I said, my voice dangerously soft as I placed the tray down with a soft clink. The tap in the guest bathroom is dripping again. Could you take a look when you have a moment? He let out a sigh. It was a sound I knew well, a long, drawn-out exhalation of pure frustration. The kind of sigh you let out when a child asks the same question for the 100th time. The kind of sigh that says, you are a burden. Mom, can't it wait? He snapped, his eyes still glued to the screen, to the valuation of the house he couldn't inherit quickly enough. We're trying to figure out our finances. It's important. Of course, dear, I said softly. Of course. I turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind me. I did not go to the kitchen. I did not go for the documents. Not yet. I had one more piece of evidence to collect. I needed to see how deep the rot went. I walked into the living room and sat down in Robert's old wingback chair. I picked up a book, but the words swam before my eyes. I was listening, waiting. I sat there for an hour, then 2. The house was filled with the low murmur of their voices from the study, the sound of a conspiracy. Finally, the study door opened. They emerged, their faces grim but resolved, like soldiers who had just planned a difficult but necessary campaign. They didn't see me sitting in the shadows of the living room. They went straight to the kitchen. I heard the fridge open, the clink of glasses, and then I heard their voices again, clearer this time. It's the only way, Tom, Fiona said, her voice firm, stripped of the earlier whisper. The valuation is even higher than we thought. It would solve everything, everything. I know, my son replied, and the resignation in his voice was the final nail in my coffin. It's just, it feels wrong. What feels wrong? She scoffed. Planning for our future? Making sure our daughter has a good life? Or are you content to drown in debt while your mother lives in a 5-bedroom house she doesn't need? Her words were poison darts, and they found their mark. I heard him sigh again, the sound of his last moral objection dissolving. You're right, he said. You're right. It's just a matter of time. A matter of time. My time. I closed my eyes. The jury had returned. The verdict was in. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for hope. The mother in me had grieved and died in the hallway. The wife in me yearned for the comfort of the man who had laid the foundations of this house with love, not greed. But the woman who was left, sitting there in the dark, was someone new. She was Clara Annabelle Sterling. And she was the owner of the walls that had just heard her own children sentence her to death. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. My purpose was a burning coal in my chest, keeping me awake, keeping me focused. My plan was simple. It was elegant. It was final. And it would begin not with a shout, but with a phone call. The storm was coming for Thomas and Fiona. They just didn't know that I was the one holding the lightning. You do. The sun came up the next morning, just as it always does. It streamed through the kitchen window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. But the light felt different, colder, sharper. The silence in the house was different, too. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a tomb waiting to be opened. I had made my decision in the dark, with their whispered words echoing off the walls of my memory. There was no hesitation, no lingering doubt. The woman who had wept for the son she had lost was gone. In her place was a woman who had a job to do. I made my coffee, my movements precise and automatic. I buttered my toast. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the clock on the wall tick. 7:15, 7:30. At 7:45, I heard their footsteps on the stairs. Fiona came down first, already dressed for work in a severe gray suit, her face a mask of professional ambition. She grabbed a yogurt from the fridge and a bottle of water, her movements brisk and efficient, as if the house and everyone in it were an obstacle in her morning marathon. She gave me a tight, meaningless smile. "Morning, Clara." It wasn't a greeting. It was a box being ticked on a long to-do list. Thomas followed a few minutes later. He looked tired, defeated. The moral battle he had briefly waged with himself was over, and he had lost. He poured himself a coffee, his back to me the entire time. He didn't say a word. He knew, on some level, that a line had been crossed. He just didn't know that I had been standing on the other side, listening. He probably felt guilty, and that guilt manifested as annoyance towards me, the source of it. It's easier to be angry at someone than to be angry at yourself. I watched them from my seat at the table. I didn't hide. I didn't look away. I simply observed them, the way a scientist might observe two foreign species. They gathered their things, their briefcases, their car keys. They were a team, a unit with a single, unified purpose: to get ahead. And I now understood, simply a liability on their balance sheet, an asset that had not yet matured. "We'll be late tonight," Fiona said, pulling on her coat. "Dinner with the Hendersons. Don't wait up." The Hendersons were a wealthy couple they were trying to impress, hoping to secure an investment for one of Thomas's failing business ideas. Their entire life was a performance. Thomas finally glanced at me. "Yeah, Mom, just have a quiet day." A quiet day. The irony of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. "You too, dear," I said. My voice was calm, serene. It seemed to unnerve them more than shouting would have. They kissed each other at the door, a quick, dry peck that was more habit than affection, and then they were gone. The sound of their car engine faded down the street, and the silence returned. But now, it was my silence, my house. I sat there for another 10 minutes, letting the engine of their departure fully fade from the world. I finished my coffee. I rinsed my cup in the sink and placed it on the draining rack. Then, I went to the bottom drawer of the old Welsh dresser. My fingers, steady as a surgeon's, pulled the handle. Behind the neatly folded tablecloths and the box of Robert's old letters, there was the large manila folder. I pulled it out. The paper felt cool and heavy in my hands. On the tab, in my own careful handwriting, were 2 words: house deeds. I didn't need to open it. I knew what it said. I walked to the telephone on the wall, the old rotary one Robert had insisted on keeping. It felt solid and real, in a way the new cordless ones never did. My finger was steady as I dialed the number for Arthur Davies's office. I had known it by heart for 40 years. He was Robert's lawyer, then our lawyer, and now he was my lawyer. He was a good man, a man from an older time, a time when a person's word was their bond. His secretary put me right through. "Clara," Arthur's voice came down the line, warm and familiar. "How are you? I haven't heard from you in ages." "I'm well, Arthur, thank you for asking," I said, and my voice was so level it surprised even me. "I need your help with something. It requires your utmost discretion." "Of course," Anything. I took a breath. This was the moment. The first stone of the avalanche. Arthur, I want to sell the house. There was no gasp on the other end of the line. No shocked silence. Arthur knew me. He had known Robert. He had seen Thomas grow up and had watched Fiona's influence spread like ivy over him. He just sighed, a quiet, sad sound of resignation. I understand, Clara, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Do you have a buyer in mind? I do, I said, myself. I want you to set up a blind trust. I will fund it with my own savings, and the trust will purchase the house from me for $1. I want the ownership transferred immediately, today if possible, and I want the new owner on record to be an anonymous entity. Can you do that? I could hear the smile in his voice. It was the smile of a lawyer who appreciated a clever, watertight strategy. Clara, that is an elegant solution. It creates an unbreakable legal firewall. Of course I can do that. I'll get started right away. The documents will be ready for your signature by this afternoon. There's more, Arthur, I continued. Once the transfer is complete, I need you to prepare an official notice of eviction. 30 days, as per the law, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sterling. This time there was a short pause. Consider it done, he said, his voice now all business. And Clara, I'm sorry it has come to this. So am I, Arthur, I replied, and I hung up the phone. And just like that, it was done. A 5-minute phone call had undone years of misplaced trust. A legal lever had been pulled, and the great, heavy machine of justice was beginning to turn. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief. A profound, bone-deep sense of relief, as if I had been carrying a great weight on my back for years and had only just now set it down. The house itself seemed to exhale with me. I looked around my kitchen, and I knew what I had to do next. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a spiritual one. I had to cleanse the house of their presence. I went upstairs to the room at the end of the hall. It used to be my sewing room. After Robert passed, it became my quiet place, filled with my books, his old photographs, and the scent of lavender from the garden. When Thomas and Fiona moved in, they'd asked if they could temporarily use it for storage. Temporarily had turned into 5 years. I opened the door. It was a graveyard of their ambitions and their carelessness. In the corner was Fiona's exercise bike, draped in clothes she'd meant to return to the store, a thick layer of dust on its digital display. Next to it were Thomas's old golf clubs, relics from a time when he had hobbies other than accumulating debt. There were boxes of financial records, stacks of magazines on luxury living, and a broken lamp they'd never bothered to fix. This wasn't a storage room. It was a monument to their disrespect. They had taken my sanctuary and filled it with their junk. I went to the garage and found the stack of flat-packed cardboard boxes I kept for charity donations. I brought them upstairs, one by one, and I began to pack. My movements were methodical. I wasn't angry. I didn't throw things. I simply sorted and packed. I folded Fiona's expensive, unworn clothes and laid them gently in a box. I carefully wrapped the broken lamp in newspaper. I dusted off Thomas's golf clubs before placing them in a long, narrow box. It was a strange, almost serene process. With every item I packed, I was reclaiming a piece of myself. I was separating their life from mine, literally boxing up the evidence of their intrusion. This is not yours. This is not mine. This chapter is over. It took me all morning. When I was finished, a neat stack of 12 boxes stood in the middle of the room. The room itself was empty, save for the dust marks on the carpet where their things had been. It looked bigger, brighter, I opened the window and the scent of roses and freshly cut grass filled the space. It smelled like my room again. At 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was a courier, a young man in a crisp uniform holding a clipboard and a large white envelope. He didn't know he was delivering the ammunition for my war. "For Mrs. Clara Sterling," he said. I signed my name. He handed me the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy, filled with the legal weight of my decision. I closed the door and stood in the hallway, holding the verdict in my hand. I walked into the kitchen and placed it in the exact center of the oak table. It lay there, white and stark against the dark wood. A ticking time bomb, a declaration of independence, a final, undeniable statement of fact. I made myself a cup of tea, real tea, this time, hot and strong, and sat down to wait. The hours ticked by. The afternoon sun slanted across the floor, painting long shadows on the walls. The house was clean. The garden was tidy. My affairs were in order. At 6:30, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the slam of 2 car doors, the jingle of keys at the front door. They were home, and their eviction notice was waiting for them. 3. The sun came up the next morning, just as it always does. It streamed through the kitchen window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. But the light felt different, colder. The silence in the house was different too. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a tomb. I had made my decision in the dark, with their whispered words echoing off the walls of my memory. There was no hesitation. The woman who had wept for the son she had lost was gone. In her place was a woman who had a job to do. I made my coffee, my movements precise and automatic. I buttered my toast. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the clock on the wall. Tick, 7:15, 7:30. At 7:45, I heard their footsteps on the stairs. Fiona came down first, already dressed for work, her face a mask of professional ambition. She grabbed a yogurt from the fridge and a bottle of water, her movements brisk and efficient, as if the house and everyone in it were an obstacle in her morning marathon. She gave me a tight, meaningless smile. "Morning, Clara." It wasn't a greeting. It was a box being ticked. Thomas followed a few minutes later. He looked tired, defeated. He poured himself a coffee, his back to me the entire time. He didn't say a word. He knew, on some level, that a line had been crossed. He just didn't know that I had been standing on the other side, listening. He probably felt guilty, and that guilt manifested as annoyance towards me, the source of it. It's easier to be angry at someone than to be angry at yourself. I watched them from my seat at the table. I didn't hide. I didn't look away. I simply observed them, the way a scientist might observe 2 foreign species. They gathered their things, their briefcases, their car keys. They were a team, a unit with a single, unified purpose, to get ahead. And I now understood, simply a liability on their balance sheet. "We'll be late tonight," Fiona said, pulling on her coat. "Dinner with the Hendersons. Don't wait up." Thomas finally glanced at me. "Yeah, Mom. Just have a quiet day. A quiet day." The irony of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. "You too, dear," I said. My voice was calm, serene. They kissed each other at the door, a quick, dry peck, and then they were gone. The sound of their car engine faded down the street, and the silence returned. But now, it was my silence, my house. I sat there for another 10 minutes, letting the engine of their departure fully fade from the world. I finished my coffee. I rinsed my cup in the sink and placed it on the draining rack. Then I walked to the telephone on the wall, the old rotary one Robert had insisted on keeping. It felt solid and real, in a way the new cordless ones never did. My hand didn't shake as I picked up the receiver. My finger was steady as I dialed the number for Arthur Davies's office. I had known it by heart for 40 years. He was Robert's lawyer, then our lawyer, and now he was my lawyer. He was a good man, a man from an older time, a time when a person's word was their bond. His secretary put me right through. "Clara," Arthur's voice came down the line, warm and familiar. "How are you? I haven't heard from you in ages." "I'm well, Arthur. Thank you for asking," I said, and my voice was so level it surprised even me. "I need your help with something." "Of course, anything." I took a breath. "Arthur, good morning. It's Clara. I want to revoke the deed of gift for the house. The process was never finalized, so I believe I have every right." "And, please, prepare an official notice of eviction. 30 days, as per the law." There was no gasp on the other end of the line, no shocked silence or probing questions. Arthur knew me. He had known Robert. He had seen Thomas grow up. He had probably seen this coming in a way I never could have. He just sighed, a quiet, sad sound. "I understand, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. The final transfer was contingent on a few signatures we never received. "Your name is the only one that matters on that document. The documents will be ready today by noon. A courier will deliver the notice to them tomorrow morning. Is that what you want?" "That is what I want," I said. There was no doubt, no flicker of uncertainty. It was like lancing a wound, painful, but necessary to let the poison out. "Consider it done," he said. "And Clara, I'm sorry it has come to this." "So am I, Arthur," I replied, and I hung up the phone. And just like that, it was done. A 5-minute phone call had undone years of misplaced trust. A legal lever had been pulled, and the great, heavy machine of justice was beginning to turn. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief. A profound, bone-deep sense of relief, as if I had been carrying a great weight on my back for years and had only just now set it down. The house itself seemed to exhale with me. I looked around my kitchen, and I knew what I had to do next. I went upstairs to the room at the end of the hall. It used to be my sewing room. After Robert passed, it became my quiet place, filled with my books, his old photographs, and the scent of lavender from the garden. When Thomas and Fiona moved in, they'd asked if they could temporarily use it for storage. Temporarily had turned into 5 years. I opened the door. It was a graveyard of their ambitions and their carelessness. In the corner was Fiona's exercise bike, draped in clothes she'd meant to return to the store, a thick layer of dust on its digital display. Next to it were Thomas's old golf clubs, relics from a time when he had hobbies other than accumulating debt. There were boxes of financial records, stacks of magazines on luxury living, and a broken lamp they'd never bothered to fix. This wasn't a storage room. It was a monument to their disrespect. They had taken my sanctuary and filled it with their junk. I went to the garage and found the stack of flat-packed cardboard boxes I kept for charity donations. I brought them upstairs, one by one, and I began to pack. My movements were methodical. I wasn't angry. I didn't throw things. I simply sorted and packed. I folded Fiona's expensive, unworn clothes and laid them gently in a box. I carefully wrapped the broken lamp in newspaper. I dusted off Thomas's golf clubs before placing them in a long, narrow box. It was a strange, almost serene process. With every item I packed, I was reclaiming a piece of myself. I was separating their life from mine, literally boxing up the evidence of their intrusion. This is not yours. This is not mine. This chapter is over. It took me all morning. When I was finished, a neat stack of 12 boxes stood in the middle of the room. The room itself was empty, save for the dust marks on the carpet where their things had been. It looked bigger, brighter. I opened the window, and the scent of roses and freshly cut grass filled the space. It smelled like my room again. The rest of the day passed in a quiet blur. I worked in the garden, my hands in the soil, feeling the earth that was truly, unequivocally mine. I pruned the roses Robert and I had planted. I pulled up the weeds that had been allowed to grow for too long. I was not just gardening, I was restoring order. At 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was a courier, a young man in a crisp uniform holding a clipboard and a large, white envelope. "For Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sterling," he said. "They're not home," I replied. "But I can sign for it." He checked his instructions. "Yes, ma'am. That's fine." I signed my name, Clara Annabel Sterling, on the line. He handed me the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy. It felt like it was made of lead. I closed the door and stood in the hallway, holding the verdict in my hand. I walked into the kitchen and placed it in the exact center of the oak table. It lay there, white and stark against the dark wood, a ticking time bomb, a declaration of independence, a final, undeniable statement of fact. I made myself a cup of tea, real tea, this time, hot and strong, and sat down to wait. The hours ticked by. The afternoon sun slanted across the floor, painting long shadows on the walls. The house was clean. The garden was tidy. My affairs were in order. At 6:30, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the slam of 2 car doors, the jingle of keys at the front door. They were home, and their eviction notice was waiting for them. They walked in at 6:32. I know the exact time because the grandfather clock in the hall had just begun its evening chime. It was a sound that used to comfort me, the steady, reliable heartbeat of our home. That night, it sounded like a countdown. Fiona came in first, as always, talking into her phone, her voice a sharp staccato rhythm of business jargon. Thomas followed, loosening his tie, a deep sigh escaping his lips as he dropped his briefcase by the door. The sound of a man returning to his castle, a castle he no longer owned. I didn't move from my chair in the living room. It was Robert's old wingback, the one with the worn leather arms. I had a book in my lap, but I wasn't reading. I was simply waiting. "Clara, you left an envelope on the table," Fiona called from the kitchen, her voice laced with that familiar tone of mild annoyance, as if I had left a mess for her to clean up. "It looks official." I heard the tearing of paper, a sharp, violent sound, then silence. Not the heavy, waiting silence from before, but a new kind, a stunned, uncomprehending silence. I could picture her standing there, her eyes scanning the dense legal text, her brain refusing to process the words. Thomas must have walked in to see what was wrong. I heard his confused voice. "Fee? What is it?" More silence. Then, a strange sound, a short, sharp bark of laughter. It was Fiona. "It's a joke," she said, her voice thin and high. "Your mother is playing some kind of sick joke." "What are you talking about?" Thomas's voice was closer now. He must have taken the letter from her. I heard the rustle of the paper as he read it. The silence that followed his reading was different from hers. It was deeper. The silence of a man falling from a great height. He appeared in the doorway of the living room, the white pages trembling in his hand. Fiona was right behind him, her face a pale mask of fury. "Mom," Thomas said. His voice was a child's voice, small and lost. "What is this?" I looked up from my book, marking my page with my finger. I met his eyes. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply looked at him. "It is," I said, my voice perfectly even, "a legal notice. It means you have 30 days to vacate the premises." The reality of it hit them then. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a mistake. It was a fact. Fiona found her voice first, and it was a shriek. "You can't do this! You senile old woman, you can't do this! This is our house!" "No, Fiona," I said calmly. "It is my house. It has always been my house. We live here! We've paid the bills, the taxes!" she screamed, stepping into the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was vibrating with rage. "You lived here as my guests," I corrected her gently, "and the bills you paid were in lieu of the rent you were never charged." Thomas finally moved. He stumbled into the room and sank onto the ottoman across from me, the letter crushed in his fist. "Mom, how could you?" he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "After everything we've done for you, we took you in. We've been looking after you, looking after me." The words were so twisted, so divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. They had looked after me the way a zookeeper looks after an animal that is no longer profitable but hasn't had the decency to die yet. "I don't wish to argue, Thomas," I said, my gaze unwavering. "You have 30 days. Any questions you have should be directed to my lawyer. His number is on the letter." That was the line, the boundary, the wall they could not pass, and they threw themselves against it, again and again. "A lawyer?" Fiona spat the word. "You went to a lawyer behind our backs? We'll get our own lawyer. He'll tear this to shreds. We have rights." "You have the rights of a tenant at will who has been given a legal notice of eviction," I said, quoting the phrase Arthur had used on the phone. "Nothing more." "This is insane." She was pacing now, a caged animal in a room that had suddenly shrunk around her. "You owe us! For the new kitchen, for the landscaping. We've poured money into this house." "You renovated my kitchen to your own tastes, using my money," I reminded her. "The inheritance Robert left for me, not for you." Every word they threw at me, every accusation, was a gift. It was a confirmation, written in the ink of their own greed and fury, that I had done the right thing. The soft, foolish part of me that might have felt a pang of guilt was being systematically murdered by their ugliness. I wasn't destroying my family. I was finally seeing that, for them, family was just a business arrangement that had stopped paying dividends. Thomas tried a different tactic. The manipulator, the son. He leaned forward, trying to force a connection, his voice dropping to a pleading tone. "Mom, please, think about this. Where will we go? What about Sarah? Are you really going to throw your own granddaughter out onto the street?" That was a low blow. And it was a mistake. "Sarah is welcome in this house any time she wishes," I said, and my voice turned to ice. "My granddaughter will always have a home here. This notice is for you. And for her." I pointed a finger at Fiona, who stopped her pacing and stared at me, her mouth open. "You brought this on yourselves." "I brought this on?" Fiona shrieked. "I have done nothing but try to build a life here. A life you have been actively sabotaging with your constant needs, your moods, your presence." There it was, the truth, finally spoken aloud. My presence was the problem. My life was the sabotage. It was exactly what I had heard them whispering in the study, just said to my face instead of behind my back. A strange sense of peace washed over me. The clarity was absolute. "I understand," I said quietly. "You have 30 days. They raged for nearly an hour. They threatened, they begged, they accused. Thomas even tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. his face just crumpled into a mask of self-pity. Fiona brought up every perceived slight from the past 5 years. The time I'd criticized her cooking, the time I'd asked her to turn down the music, the money they'd spent on my prescriptions. They were throwing rocks at a fortress. Throughout it all, I remained in my chair. I was an island of calm in their hurricane. On the small table next to me, where Robert's pipe stand used to be, sat my set of keys to the house, the original set. At one point, when Fiona was screaming about how they had more right to the house than I did, my hand went and rested on them. I didn't pick them up. I just rested my fingers on the cold, solid brass. They were a tangible symbol of the truth. This is mine. The power is here. Finally, they ran out of steam. The storm exhausted itself. Fiona slumped onto the sofa, her face blotchy and red, breathing heavily. Thomas just sat on the ottoman, his head in his hands, the crumpled letter lying on the floor at his feet. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock. I looked at them, my son and his wife. They were not monsters, they were just weak, hollowed out by wanting things they hadn't earned, and I felt a profound sense of pity for them. Not love. The love had been burned out of me, cauterized by their words. Just a sad, empty pity. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. They both looked up at me, their eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperate hope, as if I might still relent and tell them it was all a terrible mistake. I am going to bed now, I said, my voice soft but final. The boxes with your things from my old sewing room are by the front door. I suggest you start packing. You have 29 days left. I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving them there in the wreckage of the future they had tried to build on my grave. I did not look back. I walked up the stairs, my hand trailing on the smooth, cool wood of the banister Robert had sanded by hand. Each step was a step toward my own life. I had bought my peace. The price was my son. And, as I closed my bedroom door, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had made the right choice. In Distact, the next few days were a strange ballet of avoidance. We moved through the house like ghosts, occupying the same space but never the same reality. They spoke only when necessary, their voices clipped and brittle. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, a silence louder than their shouting had been. I watched them move boxes, their faces grim. They were dismantling the life they had assumed was theirs, piece by piece, and the resentment radiated from them in palpable waves. Fiona was a wraith of cold fury. She wouldn't look at me, but I could feel her eyes on my back as I worked in the kitchen or read in the living room. Her silence was a weapon, meant to punish me, to make me feel the weight of what I had done. But it had the opposite effect. Her silence was a gift. It was peace. Thomas was different. He was lost. He wandered through the rooms as if seeing them for the first time, his expression a mixture of confusion and a deep, gnawing sorrow. He wasn't just losing a house. He was losing the entire narrative of his life, the story in which he was a good son, a successful man, a loving father. He was seeing the man he had become in the harsh, unforgiving light of my decision, and he didn't know who that person was. I saw him pick up an old photograph of himself as a boy, standing next to me under the oak tree, and his shoulders slumped. He was mourning a version of himself he could no longer pretend to be. The final conversation happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days after the notice was served. I was in the garden, tending to Robert's roses. The late afternoon sun was warm on my back, and the air smelled of earth and blooming flowers. I had a pair of old pruning shears in my hand, the steel cool and efficient against the woody stems. I was cutting away the dead wood, the spent blooms, making space for new growth. It was a task that required focus, a quiet meditation. He approached me from behind. I heard the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel path, slow and hesitant. I didn't turn around. I just kept snipping, the rhythmic click-clack of the shears the only sound between us. "Mom," his voice was quiet, stripped of the anger and pleading from the other night. It was just tired. I snipped off a withered rose, its petals brown and curled at the edges, and let it fall to the ground. "Thomas," I said, my back still to him. He stood there for a long moment. I could feel him struggling, searching for the right words, for an angle he hadn't yet tried. I don't understand," he said finally, the words heavy with a manufactured bewilderment. "I've been going over and over it in my head. I don't understand. For what? What did we do that was so terrible?" I stopped my work. I turned around slowly, the shears still in my gloved hand. I looked at my son. His face was etched with a pathetic, desperate innocence. He was actually trying to convince himself, and me, that he was the victim. That was the most unforgivable part of all. Not the greed, not the cruelty, but the cowardly refusal to even acknowledge it. "You really don't know?" I asked. My voice was not accusatory. It was genuinely curious. I wanted to see how far he would push this lie. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't. We've had our disagreements, but this, throwing us out of our home, it's cruel." I took a step closer to him. The scent of the roses was thick in the air. "I was carrying a tray of tea to you and Fiona," I began, my voice low and steady. "The other afternoon, before the letter, the study door was slightly ajar. I stopped in the hallway because I heard you talking. I watched his face. A flicker of something fear, recognition passed through his eyes, but it was gone in an instant. His mask of confused innocence held firm. "We were talking about finances, Mom," he said quickly, defensively. "It's been stressful." "Yes," I nodded. "You were. I heard Fiona say how much easier things would be if you could just sell the house. I heard her say it would be simpler for everyone if," and then she stopped. I held his gaze, my own eyes as steady and sharp as the shears in my hand. "I know what she meant, Thomas, and so do you." He paled. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was caught. The lie he had been telling himself had just been dissected in front of him. "You said don't say that," I continued, my voice relentless but calm. But there was no conviction in your voice. There was no defense of me. There was just tiredness. The weariness of a man who agrees with the sentiment but is uncomfortable hearing it said aloud. I took another step. We were standing by the oldest rose bush, the one Robert called the Clara. Its blooms were a deep, velvety red. "You see, Thomas, you didn't want to wait. Waiting for me to die was becoming an inconvenience, a delay in your financial planning. Your life was being held up by mine, so I decided to help you." I raised the shears and deliberately snipped off a large dead branch near the base of the bush. It fell to the ground with a dry crack. "I have freed you," I said, looking from the dead branch back to his face. "I have freed you from the terrible burden of waiting for my death. Now you can go and find your simpler life somewhere else, but you will not find it in my house. You will not build it on my grave." The finality in my voice was absolute. It was a closing door, a verdict delivered. He just stared at me, his face a ruin of shock and shame. He had no more arguments, no more manipulations. There was nothing left to say. He knew that I knew. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement near the back porch. It was Sarah. She had her phone in her hand, but it was lowered, forgotten. Her face was white, her eyes wide. She had heard it all. She had heard what her parents were. In that moment, I saw the innocence break in her eyes, replaced by a terrible adult understanding. My heart ached for her, for the pain this truth would cause her, but it was a necessary pain, like setting a broken bone. It hurts, but it is the only way to heal. Thomas saw her too. He flinched, as if struck. The sight of his daughter, hearing his condemnation from his own mother's lips, was his final undoing. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at me. He just turned, a broken man, and walked back towards the house, his steps heavy and shuffling. I stood there in the garden for a long time after he had gone, the pruning shears in my hand. I looked at Sarah, who was still frozen on the porch. I gave her a small, sad smile, an acknowledgement of the painful new world she had just entered. Then I turned back to my roses. I worked until the sun began to set, methodically cutting away everything that was dead or dying. I cleared the thorns, the withered leaves, the blighted stems. With each cut, I felt a piece of the past fall away. I wasn't just pruning a rose bush. I was clearing the ground for my future, a future where I could breathe, a future that would be mine, and mine alone. The dead wood was gone. Now, we would see what would grow in its place. Teps. The 30th day arrived, not with a storm, but with a quiet, methodical rumble of a moving truck. It parked on the gravel driveway at precisely 9 a.m, a large, impersonal white box ready to swallow the remnants of my son's life in my home. I watched from the kitchen window, a mug of coffee warming my hands. I did not go out. I did not supervise. I did not offer a final, conciliatory word. I had said everything that needed to be said. This was simply the mechanical process of an ending. Thomas and Fiona moved with a grim, resentful efficiency. They directed the movers in clipped, angry tones, their bodies stiff with the humiliation of their retreat. They never once looked towards the house, towards the window where I stood. To them, I was no longer a person. I was the architect of their ruin, an immovable force that had derailed their lives. They were right. I watched them carry out the large, modern sofa that had replaced Robert's comfortable tweed armchair. I watched them haul away the sleek, glass dining table that had never felt right in the warm, oak-floored dining room. Each piece of furniture they removed felt like a word being erased from a sentence that had been written incorrectly. They were taking their story with them and leaving behind the original text. Sarah was there, but she stood apart from them, near the old oak tree. She wasn't helping. She was just watching, her young face a portrait of quiet sorrow. She caught my eye once, through the window, and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was a gesture of apology, of shared grief for something that had been irrevocably broken. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod in return. I know. It's all right. By early afternoon, the truck was full. The house was hollowed out, echoing with the ghosts of their presence. I watched as Thomas did a final walkthrough of the empty rooms, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Fiona sat in the passenger seat of their car, staring straight ahead, her face like stone. The last thing I saw was Thomas placing his key on the small table on the front porch. He didn't try the door. He didn't look back. He just got in the car, and they drove away. The sound of their engine faded, leaving behind a silence that was absolute. I waited a full hour before I opened the front door. The key was sitting there, glinting in the afternoon sunday. I picked it up. It felt light, insignificant. I dropped it into the pocket of my apron and stepped back inside. The house was empty, but it wasn't clean. It felt contaminated. It smelled of their expensive, cloying air fresheners, of Fiona's sharp perfume, of the lingering tension of the last month. It was a space cleared of objects, but still full of bad memories, and so my ritual began. It was not a ritual of anger or triumph. It was a ritual of reclamation. I walked from room to room and threw open every single window, even though it was a cool autumn day. I wanted the wind to blow through the house, to chase out the stale air of their unhappiness, to carry away the echoes of their whispers and their shouts. I wanted the scent of the garden of roses and damp earth and turning leaves to fill the space once more. Next, I went to the attic. In a large wooden chest, tucked under a pile of Robert's old wool blankets, were the things Fiona had deemed too old-fashioned for her modern aesthetic. I unwrapped them one by one, the heavy, silver-framed photographs of Robert and me on our wedding day, of a laughing Thomas as a toddler on his first tricycle, the worn, hand-stitched sampler my own grandmother had made with its faded motto, "This is where you belong." I brought them downstairs. I placed Robert's picture back on the mantelpiece, exactly where it had stood for 30 years. I hung the sampler in the hallway. I put the small, chipped porcelain bird Robert had won for me at a country fair back on the kitchen windowsill. With each object returned to its rightful place, I felt the house settle. It was breathing again. Its soul was returning. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. I wasn't just wiping away dust. I was scrubbing away their presence. I used my own mixture of lemon and vinegar, the scent clean and sharp, erasing the artificial vanilla and sandalwood they had used to mask the home's true character. I polished the oak dining table until it gleamed, its surface now clear and ready for new memories. I washed the curtains. I beat the rugs. I aired out every room until the house felt like mine again. As dusk began to fall, I made myself a pot of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, clean, and empty, but it no longer felt empty in a painful way. It felt expectant, ready. The emptiness was no longer a void. It was a space waiting to be filled, and I knew exactly how I was going to fill it. The next morning, I called Arthur Davies. "Arthur," I said, my voice clear and strong. "It's done. They're gone." "I'm glad to hear it, Clara," he said gently. "What's the next step?" "The next step is the future," I said. "I want you to draw up the papers for a trust. I want to put the house in it. The sole beneficiary is to be my granddaughter, Sarah Sterling. She is to have full control and ownership on her 21st birthday. Until then, I will be the trustee, and this will be her home as much as it is mine." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Arthur spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Robert would be very proud of you, Clara." "I know," I said quietly. "He would." A few days later, Sarah came to visit. She came alone, riding her bicycle up the gravel driveway. She looked nervous, as if she wasn't sure of her welcome. I met her at the door with a smile and a hug that she sank into. We didn't talk about her parents. There was no need. The silence on that subject was a shared understanding. Instead, we talked about her school, about a book she was reading, about the coming winter. I made her tea and cinnamon toast, the way I used to when she was a little girl. She started coming every few days. We would work in the garden together, her young, nimble fingers a perfect complement to my slower, more experienced hands. She helped me plant a new apple tree, a young sapling, just a few yards from the great oak we had planted for her father. One afternoon, as we were staking the young tree, she looked up at the towering branches of the oak. "You planted that for my dad, didn't you?" she asked softly. "We did," I said, tamping the soil around the apple tree's base. "Are you going to cut it down?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I stopped my work and looked at her. "No, my darling," I said, my voice firm. "Never. It is a part of this home's story. A sad part, now, but it is still part of the story. You don't destroy the past just because it hurts. You learn from it, and you plant something new beside it." She looked from the old oak to the new apple tree, and a slow smile spread across her face. In that moment, the emptiness that had taken root in my heart when I lost my son began to fill with a new, different kind of love. It wasn't the love of a mother for her child, but something just as fierce. The love of an architect for the future she was building. I had lost a son, but I had gained a daughter of the heart. I had cleared my house of its ghosts, not with anger, but with purpose. And in the quiet, sun-filled rooms, surrounded by the memories I had chosen to keep and the future I was choosing to build, I was finally, truly, home. 2 winters had passed, then a third. The young apple tree we had planted was no longer a sapling. This past spring, it had produced its first shy blossoms, and now a handful of small, promising apples hung from its branches, reddening in the autumn Sunday. The house had settled back into itself, its silences no longer echoing with absence, but filled with a comfortable, lived-in peace. The rooms were full of Sarah's life, her textbooks on the kitchen table, her music drifting down the stairs, the scent of her shampoo in the upstairs hallway. She was 18. And the house, my house, our house, was alive with the preparations for her birthday. This was to be our new tradition. Not a tense holiday dinner under a roof of obligation, but a celebration of life, held in the open air of the garden. We had spent the afternoon stringing fairy lights through the branches of the old oak tree, the one planted for Thomas. I felt no bitterness as I did it. The tree was not his fault. It was a living thing, a silent witness to joy and then to sorrow, and now it would be a witness to joy again. Its strong, enduring branches were the perfect canopy for a new beginning. Our new family was arriving. Mr. Davies, frailer now but with the same kind eyes, settled himself in a comfortable chair with a glass of lemonade. Our neighbors from next door, who had watched this house through all its seasons, brought a homemade cake. Sarah's friends, a vibrant, laughing group of young people on the cusp of their own lives, filled the garden with an energy it hadn't felt in decades. Sarah moved among them, her face bright, with a happiness so pure it made my heart ache in the best possible way. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, kind and intelligent, with a core of strength that I knew had been forged in the quiet pain of her parents' choices. Our bond had deepened from one of grandmother and granddaughter into something more, a partnership of mutual respect and quiet, unconditional love. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, I knew it was time. I motioned for Sarah to join me on the porch steps, away from the chatter of the party. From the pocket of my cardigan, I took out a small, velvet-wrapped box. "This isn't your main present," I said, my voice a little unsteady, "but it's the most important one." She opened it. Inside, nestled on the dark blue velvet, was a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was the original key to the front door, the one Robert and I had been given on the day we signed the papers, all those years ago. "Grandma," she breathed, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful." "It's a symbol," I said, taking her hand. "A house is just wood and nails, Sarah. But a home is a place where you are safe to be yourself. A place that holds you up, that doesn't demand a price for the air you breathe. This is your home. It has been since the day you started coming here on your own, bringing your light back into these rooms. I handed her a thick envelope as well. This is a copy of the trust documents. On your 21st birthday, it all becomes yours, officially. No conditions, no strings. Just a foundation, a place to start from, or a place to come back to, always. Tears welled in her eyes and in mine. She didn't speak. She just threw her arms around my neck and held me tight. In her embrace, I felt the last of the old wounds finally truly close. The house was safe. The future was safe. We rejoined the party, my arm linked through hers. The fairy lights in the oak tree blinked on as darkness fell, casting a magical, golden glow over the laughing faces. It was a perfect moment, a fragile, beautiful bubble of peace. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. My heart gave a little jolt. It was an old, conditioned response. I rarely received texts from anyone but Sarah. I stepped away from the warmth of the party, into the cool shadows at the edge of the lawn, and pulled out my phone. An unknown number, but I knew who it was. The message was just 4 words. Happy birthday to my daughter. I stood there for a long time, the phone in my hand, the screen glowing in the dark. Thomas, after 3 years of complete silence, it wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an excuse. It was just an acknowledgement, a small, flickering light from a distant, shipwrecked shore. The old Clara would have been thrown into turmoil. The mother I used to be would have felt a surge of hope, of pain, of longing, but that woman was gone. I looked at the words, and what I felt was a quiet, clinical assessment. It was a single brick, laid on the ground, where a bridge had once stood. It was not a bridge. It was just one brick. But it was a start. His start, not mine. I thought about ignoring it. I thought about deleting it. Both felt like acts of anger, and I was no longer angry. Anger is a heavy thing to carry, and I had set it down a long time ago. My thumbs moved over the screen. I typed 1 word, 7 letters. Thank you. It wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness was a mountain he would have to climb on his own. It wasn't an invitation. The door to my life was no longer his to command. It was simply an acknowledgement of his acknowledgement. A polite, formal closing of a small, unexpected circle. It was me, telling him, and telling myself, that his actions no longer had the power to disrupt my peace. I was free. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned back to the party. The first thing I saw was Sarah, standing with her friends under the glowing branches of the oak tree, throwing her head back in a peal of pure, unadulterated laughter. The light caught the joyful tears still glistening on her cheeks. I watched her, this girl who was the future, standing under the tree that was the past, and I felt a sense of grace so profound it almost brought me to my knees. The journey had been a descent into the deepest sorrow, but it had brought me here, to this moment, to this peace. They had wanted this house to be their bank, a cold asset to be liquidated. Instead, it had become her fortress, and in the end, it had become my sanctuary. Sometimes, to save the future, you have to do more than just fight for it. You have to be patient, you have to be strong, and you have to be willing to simply outlive your past.